Whether or not you believe he's the greatest driver of all time, you can't deny the impact that Ayrton Senna has had on Formula One. The triple Formula One world champion thrilled everybody associated with the sport for a decade in the 1980s and 1990s. Today we're going to do our best and try and remember the Brazilian legend and do the justice for him with a summary of his F1 career. Welcome back to the Formula One Grid Talk podcast. We are powered by the F1 Chronicle. Visit f1chronicle.com for news, reviews and opinions on all things F1. Hosting today will be me, George Howson. And joining me today are McLaren superfan Owen Davies.
Hi there.
Master of Engineering Jack Watson.
Hello.
And F1 expert Alex Booth.
Hello.
Now, thank you for joining us, gentlemen. And yes, obviously we're talking about Ayrton Senna today. It was recently 26 years, unfortunately, since he passed away at Imola the other week. We'll start at the start of his F1 career, actually a little bit before his F1 career began, Alex, because he had a very interesting introduction into F1. You know, everybody was hyped about him. You know, he had a test with Williams in '83, and I believe that Ron Dennis offered to basically give him a full scholarship for his F1 career, starting at McLaren. But he turned both of them down and started with Toleman in '84.
Yeah, the story goes he wanted to keep financial control of his career. He did have talks with Ron Dennis, as you say, and he had his test with Frank Williams. He also tested for Brabham, but Nelson Piquet didn't particularly want him in the team, so that shut that door. And yeah, so it was Toleman who gave him his Formula One debut.
Yeah, and Toleman back then, not exactly a big team. They eventually became Benetton down the line. Well, not a big team then, but, you know, Owen, I mean, he hit the ground running, though, in a car that was really not that good. I mean, he scored points in one of his first few races in South Africa and then obviously went on to that legendary race in Monaco.
Yeah, it's the one in Monaco which I think really kind of captured everyone's attention and certainly captured the attention of some of the bigger teams, and that he kind of made his presence very much felt at that race, as controversial as it was. But he kind of, in that race, he kind of showed us a few things that he would later become a master of: the wet weather, the street circuits. Nearly beating Alain Prost in his first proper year in Formula One is quite incredible when you look back on it, really.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, they always say that the talent shows in the wet, Jack, and that day in Monaco, you know, it was so wet. You know, we're used to Monaco and gleaming sunshine, but that day, you know, it was that wet that nowadays they wouldn't even race at all. That they stopped the race controversially for the rain. It's obviously it's a very long time since it happened. What's your view on it? Because it does seem that politics kind of played a part in the decision to stop that race early.
Yeah, there is still, even now, a bit of controversy over it, with Prost being aware of Senna closing down at an exceptional rate. It did showcase that it is one of those that highlighted his wet weather prowess, probably unlike anyone else you see. I wouldn't say I'd lean too far into the controversy of Prost deliberately trying to get the race stopped to prevent him losing the win.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's a hard one to judge, to be honest.
Yeah, difficult one to say. I mean, he got second place though in a Toleman, which is a very commendable achievement. But people kind of gloss over the fact, Alex, that I think he got a podium at Silverstone that year as well, and I think he got another podium at Portugal in the final race of the season. So it was far from just a one-hit wonder that year. You know, he was incredible throughout his rookie season.
Well, an interesting story from his first Formula One season comes in the Dallas race, because this kind of gives you an example of just how intense he was. And this comes from Pat Simmons, who had a very long career in Formula One with Benetton, which obviously, as we know, Toleman was then. Anyway, Senna was in the race at Dallas in the steering heat, and then he hit the tyre barrier. And he came back to the pits and he said the barrier moved, the wall had moved. And of course, you can actually imagine the team are going, pull the other one, like that. And anyway, but he somehow persuaded them to go and check it. And what happened was another car had actually hit that barrier. Because this is a street circuit with temporary barriers constructed, the wall had actually moved. And it just shows how Senna's driving was so precise that split fraction made all the difference and it caused him to crash. But it's just the fact he had the intelligence to realise that so quickly gives you an example of what sort of a driver he was.
Yeah, he was so meticulous. I think Mika Hakkinen, who was teammates with him in '93, spoke about it quite a few times. The detail that Senna went into, the effort that he went into. Even the great drivers from his era didn't go to the lengths that he did to make sure that he got the best result possible. So for '85, Senna moves to Lotus, who are a good team. Not a championship winning team at that time. They had been in the past, but they're still a good team. And Owen, he didn't get his win in the rain in Monaco in '84, but he got his first win in Portugal in, again, absolutely torrential conditions from his first pole position. His first of 65 pole positions that he got in his career.
Yeah, I mean, the Lotus years he seemed to get the best results on a street circuit where the kind of power of his car was kind of less of an issue, and the field was more kind of equalized when they were on street circuits, and that's where he scored a lot of his victories during those times in the Lotus car. But yeah, I mean, in those days, you had qualifying on the Saturday. You had the Renault engine in the back of his Lotus with a special kind of qualifying spec. You had qualifying tyres, so these were tyres manufactured only for qualifying sessions. And it was a bit like a kind of game of poker where nobody really wanted to show their hand until the last minute. And so typically with Senna driving his Lotus, he would wait until about 2-3 minutes before the end of the qualifying session, and then he would just go out and absolutely blitz this lap time, which seemed to kind of come out of nowhere. And he would invariably put the Lotus on a pole position by kind of dancing the car around the track. And it was really something. It was, the show on the Saturday was kind of almost as entertaining as the race was on the Sunday. And I think when he was at Lotus, the times when he was qualifying that car was when he really showed how good he was. By the time it came around to Sunday, typically he would kind of try and hold back as many cars as he could, but he was kind of fighting a bit of a losing battle at that point.
Yeah, he didn't have the best car, but over one lap he'd get regular pole positions in that Lotus. I mean, Owen said it there, Jack. You know, he danced the car around the track, especially at street circuits. You know, the great drivers, the truly great drivers, they outperform their car, and he absolutely outperformed that Lotus. He ragged 110% out of that piece of machinery every single time he sat in that car.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the start of some of the video footage that it's often used to describe Senna, like laps at Estoril and stuff like that, where you just see him finding areas of grip that no one else seems to be able to exploit, and keeping that peaky engine working to the way that he needed it to. That's sort of the era where you saw him developing the technique of almost having the throttle floored halfway through a corner, not even at the apex, because he could already anticipate the turbo lag coming in, so that when he wanted maximum power, it was already primed to give him the full 5 bar of boost on corner exit. And he just seemed to have that mastery of a deeper mechanical knowledge that not many people managed to get close to.
Yeah, it was incredible, and like I said there, he anticipated the grip going into the corner. He knew how much grip there'd be there for him. And that's what made him so quick in the wet, especially when it was changing lap by lap. I mean, he spent 3 years at Lotus, Alex. I mean, there's so many memorable races from him. They kind of get overlooked because of his time at McLaren later when he won his championships. But, is there any performances in there, any races in there particularly that stick out to you between 85 and 87?
There's a few. I mean, his second Grand Prix victory was at Spa in 1985, again in the wet, and he showed his shoes down there as well. And in 1986, he qualified on pole a lot of the time. And he had that memorable race in Jerez where he just narrowly pipped Nigel Mansell. And like you say, I mean, that Lotus, as good a car as it wasn't quite at the level of the Williams and the McLaren. So in 86, he did very well. And in 87, the Lotus were running active suspension that year, and which benefited enormously at circuits like Monaco and Detroit, which Owen alluded to. The street circuit was very good for Senna and the Lotus. I just think that by 87, he was kind of at his end of his tether with Lotus. I mean, he was the one who persuaded Honda or should I say, he was the one that persuaded Lotus to sign with Honda, even though they had a deal with Renault that went on beyond 86. So that was the start of that relationship. But yeah, Lotus was just not in a position to give him the championship that he desperately craved. Yeah,
they weren't quite there at that time, and Senna left in 1988 to go to McLaren. Now, this is your time to shine, Owen. He joined Alain Prost that year, and It's interesting though, because I think, again, we mentioned him earlier on about him testing Brabham. Nelson Piquet was Ron Dennis's favourite to partner Prost, but Prost insisted on having Ayrton Senna in that car alongside him, something that he probably regretted very quickly at the start of the season. It just, those two together, they've gone down as a partnership. They only lasted 2 years together at McLaren, but those two as a partnership in that car, just on another level to the rest of the grid.
Yeah. I mean, obviously 1988, I don't really need to say much about that, but it's kind of about as near total domination as you can get, really. And it's weird because 1988, there's still a kind of harmonious relationship of sorts, but by 1989, it's become a kind of toxic atmosphere between Prost and Senna, and the kind of relationship had completely broken down. And I suspect 1989 was probably quite a long season for Alain Prost. Yeah, and a kind of a bit of a civil war going on at McLaren at that point. Good times and bad times, perhaps.
Tense times in the McLaren team in those days, those 2 years. I mean, like you said, 88 was relatively respectful, and the drive that he put in, Jack, in 88 to win, I think he won the race in Japan, didn't he? Despite nearly stalling his car at the start, going all the way back down to 16th place or whatever it was. And he stormed through the pack to win the race and win his first title. I mean, that just kind of summed up the outright speed that he had, even against, the legends like Mansell, Piquet, his teammate Prost, on his day, which was most of the time, he was just unstoppable.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't exactly say it was an on his day kind of driver. That was incredible. Like, there was so much at stake, and to have had that issue at the start, nowadays when you hear like drivers saying that was X amount of qualifying laps, there was a race that had to have been a race at qualifying. Just being able to be decisive and cut through the traffic. Obviously, he was helped by the dominant package, but even then, like, there was just an imperious drive.
That wasn't the end of the action at Suzuka by any stretch.
Far from it.
But
yeah,
the MP44, like Owen mentioned there, there were 16 races in the season back then, and between Prost and Senna, they won 15, a record that is unmatched even now, even after Schumacher's days in the Ferrari, even after Hamilton and Bottas and Rosberg's day in the Mercedes. Nobody has beaten that win percentage throughout a season as a team. And that was in a day as well when, there were a lot more reliability issues. The car was bulletproof reliability almost all the time. I think they only had a few mechanical issues the whole year. So they're something else back then, McLaren. But yeah, Senna wins his first of 3 titles. He wins his first title in Suzuka in 88. And Alex, in 89, I think in 89 it starts to get really, really tense between the two teammates, him and Prost, after San Marino that year.
It really came to a head after San Marino. I mean, there were signs of it probably started in 88 in Estoril when made a move on Senna down the straight, and Senna nearly forced him into the pit wall, and Prost was really angry about that. But yeah, in 89, the race at Imola, there'd been an agreement where whoever led would not be overtaken by the second place man. Senna's argument was that because the race had been stopped because of Gerhard Berger's accident, that it was null and void and he was free to go on. Prost didn't see it that way. That was the real start of it. But there was still some great battles between the two in 89. I think Senna deserved it in 89 more than he did in 88, to be brutally honest. I think Prost drove really well in 88. If you look at 89, most of Prost's victories came in races where Senna did. Senna was very unlucky in 89. He had a lot of mechanical failures.
Absolutely came to a head in Suzuka. Yeah, I do see what you're saying, especially because 88, Prost, I think, outscored Senna because of the weird drop races rule that they still had. I think it was the last season they had it, and they got rid of it after that. Yeah, it cut Prost points down. But yeah, 89, Senna and Prost again. It comes down to Suzuka, Owen, and just the battle between those two. I mean, it gets overshadowed because of how it ended, but the battle between those two during the race, the tactical, it's just on another level. Like, I've read paragraphs about like how Prost was defending, how Senna was attacking. There was so much into it than what I would predict. It's one of the best battles you've ever seen, really, and just like two drivers just going full on.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching it at like 6:30 in the morning or whenever it was, and it was just ridiculously tense. And that moment when they come together it's kind of an iconic F1 moment, really. It's been shown many times, and I think Senna had this reputation, as we've mentioned, as someone who wouldn't ultimately yield to another driver. And I think Prost had just said, "I've had enough. You're going to have to yield to me," kind of thing, and it all came to a head in that moment. And there was a kind of long debate about whether it was correct that he rejoined the race after that incident, and that was deemed not to be correct, which I think is probably very controversial. But yeah, it set Prost on a course off to Ferrari shortly after that. And I think Senna is a very idealistic person, and he although he can be quite kind of tough and no compromise, he does ultimately believe in fairness. And I think he felt he had a very deep conviction that he was dealt with completely unfairly in that moment. That may have set events to happen the following year when we have a kind of repeat scenario.
Yeah, roles reversed next year. But in '89, for those that don't know, Senna went for a move down the inside at the chicane, the end of the Suzuka lap, last braking zone. Prost turns in now. People debated about this so much, whether Prost would have turned in too early, whether he would have made the corner. My personal viewpoint is Prost played very tactically there. And I think the absolute just killer of that, the one that confirms it for me that he played tactically, was the fact that his car was actually working all right. He could have kept going if he wanted to. There was no damage to the steering arms or anything like that. But Prost goes to the race stewards, goes to Jean-Marie Balest, who was the head of the FIA at the time, Jack, and politics played their part. And I think Senna was absolutely robbed, to be frank, because he kept going and he ended up winning the race, but ended up being disqualified.
You really do like sticking with these tough ones, don't you?
It's just the way it's fallen, Jack.
Yeah,
it's just the way you're on the rotation.
He was deemed to have broken the rules on the fact of not completing the lap. Was that correct? Or was it because you had outside assistance?
It was because he didn't complete the distance.
Yeah.
You must respect the distance.
It is a bit of a tenuous link, isn't it? You have drivers may not complete the distance if you're going to count it like that quite a lot, if they miss a braking zone and go through a runoff area.
Or if they get lapped.
Yeah, exactly. So it certainly doesn't help with French organisations supporting a French driver. It doesn't show in a good light. There's no real way it can cut in a good light. So I can understand a lot of reasoning as to why you'd think Senna was robbed, and I would have to agree.
What's your take on it, Alex? I mean, it's one of the most controversial incidents in Formula One. We've had our say. What would you say on that? Because a lot of our opinions, mine and Jack's especially, probably formed on what we've seen in Senna and stuff like that, which is obviously going to be a bit biased. But what's your take on it?
Well, looking at the onboard footage from Prost, it does look like he's turning in some way before the corner. And you touched on his car wasn't badly damaged. Joe Ramirez said that too. So maybe Prost didn't even need to get out of his car. He could have carried on. I believe that what went on in the cooling down room when Jean-Marie Balestre stormed up there and demanded that Senna was excluded, I thought that was completely outrageous. I mean, that shouldn't have happened at all. Whether there should have been a penalty imposed, that's another matter, but to be completely excluded from the race, I thought was very harsh. If they wanted to punish him for not respecting the track limits, he could have been given like they do now, a time penalty, which could have dropped him down to second place. I know that would have had the same effect. He would have still lost the championship. But I think it was handled very badly. Yeah,
very controversial issue. But let us know what you think. Whose camp you're in, Senna's camp or Prost camp on that one? Now, obviously, it was a very, very tense time at the time, Owen, and you can remember this, I'm sure. I mean, I think before 1990, it was unsure whether Senna was going to come back to race that year. I mean, it's not for the first time. Sorry, not for the last time with McLaren. I mean, what was the kind of chatter around? Were people generally thinking that he wasn't going to race?
At the time, yeah, it was a huge controversy, the manner in which Prost had won that championship. As I say, I think Senna felt really aggrieved by the whole thing, and I think he knew that Formula One had a lot of politics in it, but this was the first time that he'd kind of come up against in a major way. We were all desperately hoping that he would come back. To be partnered with Gerhard Berger, I think, was a fantastic move. The team just immediately settled down and he just seemed so much happier.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get onto. Gerhard Berger and Senna's relationship when they were at the team was complete opposite to Prost. It was a lot, let's not take anything away from Berger. He was a great driver back in his day and a fierce competitor, but just the off-track antics. I've got to give a mention to him, Jack. Some of the stories that have come out from, I think, those 3 years they were teammates. You just don't hear about things like that anymore.
No, exactly. It was the sort of reset that the McLaren team would have needed to sort of get both drivers back on side, or to get a pair of drivers on side, I should say. And it did allow. It was exactly what they needed to get back into the swing of things. I mean, I would say it's no surprise that the other two championships came in those years, just with being able to settle down and keep everyone focused on the one singular goal, rather than having to deal with infighting and controversy and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it was exactly what was needed.
Definitely benefited both, really. Both careers really helped us, that, Senna's and Berger's. But again, now let's get on to the controversy. Here's another one for Ayrton Senna, and it's Suzuka as well, Alex. Prost and Senna battling again for the championship this year. Prost at Ferrari, Senna still at McLaren. Now, I don't think there's much debate as to whether Senna meant to run Prost off the road. That's pretty clear. Going by that logic, should Senna have had a penalty? Or do you think that because of what happened in the previous year, the FIA were too scared to give him a penalty because of it?
I'm still baffled as to why no action was taken at the end of 1990. It's obvious that Senna's actions were deliberate. I mean, he hit Prost completely on the rear wing, not even touching the rear wheel. It was obvious that he just rounded to the back of him. But I think, from the fallout from the year before, I think that was probably a reason why FIA didn't really take much action against him, and he claimed his second world championship. It's such a shame that it happened, really, because I do think there's going to be something that tarnishes Ayrton Senna. It is that we all know about his character, how much he promoted safety in Formula One, but yet he was prepared to do something as dangerous as that. But having said that, at least he had the guts to admit it, because the year later in the press conference, he explained his act. Whether that's right or wrong is a different matter, but I personally think it was good of him to do so. It was a sort of hanging offence to do, because they could have easily taken his licence off him for it. And then eventually himself and Max Mosley composed some sort of apology that was not enough to make Senna feel like he'd apologised, but not enough as well for Balestri to attack him. Whatever's right or wrong, Senna got his second world championship in very controversial and sad circumstances.
Yeah, double world champion, but very, very tense times. I mean, again, Owen, I'm going to have to come to you here to kind of get a perspective as to what was happening at the time. I mean, what was the genuine talk after the race of, Senna might get that tuck off him, he might get disqualified from the championship?
Yeah, there certainly was. It was a bit uncomfortable, and if I'm honest, I don't even think Senna would want to win it in that way, but that's what he felt he had to do at that time. I mean, the real kind of root of that whole issue is to do with the side that they put him on at the start of the race, which was the kind of not the racing line, which had all the kind of marbles all over it, and so he felt he was being disadvantaged from the start. And I think in his own mind, that's how he squared doing what he did. He felt aggrieved on that front. He felt it was unfair. But I don't really like to look back on that race, because I just don't think that's really one of his finest moments, let's put it that way.
Definitely not one of his finest moments. Something that I'm sure he'd be looking down from heaven and thinking, that was a mistake, that I shouldn't have done that. But nevertheless, the world champion. And Jack, the following year, he defends his title for the first time as well, becomes a triple world champion, winning 3 of the last 4 championships for McLaren. And at that time, it just must have seemed untouchable. But obviously, there was something in the form of Williams on the horizon that would really come to more than challenge him in the following year.
Yeah, as the development races continued and Williams really got on top of active suspension, it would eventually prove too much for McLaren. This was really like McLaren at one of their peaks, one of their untouchable stages, or near untouchable. And it kind of goes back to what I said before. Of it was a bit things were made consistent. So just being able to get the results that he needed. I mean, it's still Senna, so he still had some of those amazing fights like Mansell at Catalonia and stuff like that. Unfortunate that it was his last title, and it probably should have been more.
Definitely had the opportunity to win more if he got the moves when he wanted to at the time. But, it was kind of a mess after that in a way, Alex, because, I think he was trying to join Williams multiple times, but I think he tried to join for 93 the first time. but it was blocked by Alain Prost. But even when he wasn't winning the championships, he was still a bit like Max Verstappen is now. He was still putting in the odd race performance that was like, wow, this guy is incredible. This guy has got so much pace. Like 92 in Monaco is the one that really jumps to my mind. I mean, how on earth did he keep Mansell behind?
Well, there's other ones as well. I mean, I think the one that was possibly closest to his heart would have been Brazil in '91, where he battled on despite being stuck in fifth gear. I mean, to drive a Formula One car in those days with no power steering, stuck in fifth gear on a circuit like Interlagos was just an incredible feeling, and it showed at the end when he passed out actually after the race had finished and had to be helped out of the car, and he had his muscle spasm just meant that he even struggled on the podium. He could hardly lift the trophy up. You mentioned he tried to join Williams for '93. He actually had a contract in place for '92, which was revealed recently by his manager, Julian Jacobi. But he chose to remain loyal to Honda. Whether he went on to regret that decision is probably something that we'll never know. And yes, I mean, the races in '92 in Monaco, where he held off Nigel Mansell, who'd just been into the pit because he had a puncture. '92 must have been a really difficult year for Senna, having to watch that Williams just drive off into this. And he actually watched one of his records being broken that year as well, because the year before he'd won the first 4 races, and then in '92 Mansell won the first 5. So someone like Senna would have not been happy to have seen that. And yeah, it's clear that the relationship between himself and Ron Dennis is not quite what it was before.
Yeah, the Williams move didn't happen in '92 or '93. It would happen later on. But let's go back a little bit now. I mean, you've been privileged and lucky enough to actually see Senna live in the flesh. I mean, you've seen him a few races in '91. Another race I want to touch on is, of course, Donington in 1993. You know, just that first lap, doing what he did. Only a driver like him could do that. You know, he was just on rails.
Absolutely. I think, like, we're talking about Senna at McLaren. I think Senna, the driver, improved as a driver in every year that he was at McLaren. And the Senna that was driving in '93 was, for me, is kind of really Senna at the height of his powers. Okay, the car might not have been the most competitive car, but in terms of Senna's ability and his experience level by then, he's really at the height of his powers. And he's got a great deal of kind of what you might call sort of God-given talent, which is one thing, but also he works incredibly hard to understand where the bits on the circuit are, where the grip is on the circuit, and he was overtaking cars on bits of the circuit where other drivers just did not think that you could put a car or drive with any kind of stability on. But Senna would have worked that out during pre-qualifying, qualifying. He would have worked out where the grip was, and he kind of put on that kind of a demonstration of all that on Sunday during the race, and a quite incredible display of skill, really.
Something I wanted to ask as well, because you've, like I said, you've seen him live in a few races, Owen, and you know, the first race that I went to see was Spain in 2017, and I remember that was the year when McLaren were just doing rubbish. You know, the car was not there at all. But Alonso in qualifying put in an unbelievable performance. I think he got 7th, something like that. And I remember I was sat for qualifying. I was sat by turn 8 or 9, whichever one's the fast kink, the right-hander, onto that second back straight. And I remember watching the cars through there and thinking nobody is as on the limit as Fernando Alonso. He was the guy that stood out there. Was Senna like that when you saw him go around a corner? It's just like, that guy is visibly quicker than everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the great things about being a Senna fan, is that he is such an entertaining driver to watch, because he's such an exciting driver to watch, because he's always closer to the limit than any of the other drivers are, and he kind of is brave enough to get closer to that limit, and occasionally going over that limit. But you got to see a lot of that more in the qualifying days on the Saturday rather than the race times. But I think when Senna is in the car and you're supporting Senna, you always think that anything is possible. Even if he's kind of, you know, down the field in 14th place, you always think, well, you know, it's Senna. He can actually get himself out of this. And it's incredible. Yeah.
He was just that good of a driver. He was just that quick. Yeah, something else. Really was. Another story I want to touch on, Jack, is Belgium 1992. I think it was in free practice or qualifying, but Eric Comas had a massive accident at Blanchimont. lucky to survive it, especially since his foot was still on the accelerator pedal. And Senna, we mentioned earlier on about him risking himself and Prost's lives in Suzuka in 1990, but 1992 he saved Eric Comas, and that was Senna, the human being. He's an unbelievable driver, but he was also a great human. He did so much for so many other people.
Absolutely, it kind of shows like almost a paradoxical side of him, as you say, willing to risk everything for a championship in 1990, but then knowing when he saw the state of Comas's car on the side of the road, he felt he could do nothing else other than he had to get out, and knowing to have to shut down the engine and stop the fuel getting pumped out. It's just two sides of him that could not be more different combined into one person. It's not just people on the track. He's well known for his charity work away from it, very much trying to help underprivileged people in Brazil. So there was, I suspect, probably no doubt helped by his divine beliefs, and to have such different sides of a character held in one person just seems, for me, it's what helps to hold him so highly.
Yeah, it was an incredible person. He said he gave millions to charity to children in Brazil, and I'm sure that would have continued had he lived past 1994. I mean, Owen said earlier on, Alex, 93, Senna was at the peak of his powers. Would you go along with that as well?
Absolutely. No, I share that view. I think 1993 was Senna's best year in terms of his driving performance. I mean, the races in Donington, he won again at Monaco, another fantastic home victory in Brazil. But what really puts it into perspective is that I saw an analysis recently, because the cars in 1993 were a lot more spaced out than they are now. I mean, everybody goes on about in 2019, 2020, that the gap between the top teams is too much compared to the midfield. But in 93, the Williams was sometimes over a second, nearly 2 seconds lap quicker than some of the opposition. And a lot of races at that time, they'd be lapped up to about fourth place, sometimes even third place. That doesn't happen a lot now, to be honest. And what it meant was that the performance difference between the McLaren and the Williams was, if you imagine Prost driving the Mercedes in the modern era, Senna would be driving a car that was fully on the level of the Renault. So for someone who's a modern Formula One fan, will be able to relate what kind of performance difference it was. And Senna also, this is another example of how just great he was at setting up the car and working with the team. Because McLaren, they had tried to get Renault engines for 93, that didn't happen. Then they had to make do with the customer Ford V8. And then later in the season, they had a little flirtation with Lamborghini, which had produced a V12 engine that was known for how unreliable it was. It sounded lovely, but was like a grenade most of the time. And Senna worked very hard with the engineers because he really wanted to race it, because he thought at least he'd have an engine that was almost as powerful as the Renault, and the car was a lot quicker in terms of top speed. And Senna phoned with the engineers in the sense that they changed it so it wouldn't produce as much top-end brake horsepower, but it would gain overall in terms of power to weight. I'm not an engineer, so I can't remember exactly. It was to do with the fact that it made the engine more durable. So had that happened, I mean, they might have even won a couple more races than they did. I think it was also a last-ditch effort by Ron Dennis to keep him for 94, even though they went with Peugeot engines, and although sadly that wasn't going to happen, because he finally got the move to Williams sorted out. But I totally agree. I think 1993 was Senna's finest season, without a doubt.
Many memorable performances as well in 93. I think he might have got runner-up that year, or he might have got third.
Yeah,
he got runner-up that year to beat Patrese. Was it Patrese who was Prost's teammate?
Damon Hill.
Damon Hill, of course.
It was his first full season, Damon Hill.
Yeah, to beat Hill, who would become world champion a few years after that in that Williams with his McLaren. I mean, you saw how much like drivers like Andretti struggled in that same car. That's the difference. 1994, Senna moves to Williams. Oh, and I bet you were gutted that happened, but I guess it was somewhat inevitable with all the contract talks and everything, all the rumours that were going around. It was kind of the worst kept secret in the sport at the time.
Yeah, I have to be honest. I just never thought it was a good idea, because I think the time to go to Williams would have maybe been 92. And so I feel like he missed the boat. But he arrived at Williams, and the rules in Formula One had changed. And I think that really badly affected Williams, possibly more than other teams. So he found himself in a car that was, extremely difficult to drive. And seeing, I don't know, just seeing Senna in the yellow helmet, but in this kind of blue car, it just seemed kind of weird to me, and it never felt right. I think Senna didn't enjoy being there, as far as I could tell, either. He just never seemed to be happy with the car. Every time he was interviewed, he was kind of discreetly complaining about it.
No, it was a very dark year, 94, obviously, in general. But yeah, it was strange times because of that. It was kind of passing in the garden, as it ended up being. Change the guard, sorry, I should say, because of Michael Schumacher's emergence. But, I firmly believe that, had Senna lived, he would have won the title in 94. It's a massive if and everything, but that's just what I believe. I think if Hill, no offence to Hill, if Hill could get so close in only his second full season, I think Senna would have beat Schumacher overall that year. But that's not the main point of this podcast, to speculate that. We have to get onto that fateful weekend, Jack. Imola 94, and, it was a real weekend of tragedy, not just because of Senna's passing, what happened to him, but what happened to Barrichello and, unfortunately, Roland Ratzenberger passing away too, who, Senna was mortally, he was mortified by it. He couldn't believe it.
Ratzenberger's passing had hit Senna hard beforehand, quite well known that was the case. I think I'm right in saying that he was almost not for racing at Imola because of this. As we all know, the race went ahead anyway. Yeah, as was touched on before, it was the bad times to be at Williams. He's in an awfully tricky car. I mean, he still went out and did what he does. Fantastic qualifying. We had the incident at Tamburello.
Alex, I'm sure this is one that you'll know as well, but in Senna's car, they found an Austrian flag that he was going to wave after the race in honour of Ratzenberger. I mean, we touched on, obviously, how great of a human being Senna was, but, just to have a great driver like him, a great champion, die in his prime like that, it was just, I don't think it's ever happened before. I mean, we've had champions pass away. Jochen Rindt passed away before he won the championship. We've had Gilles Villeneuve pass away, but he never won a title. But I think Senna's kind of above all that in terms of what he was to the sporting world, and what he was to Brazil.
Well, Senna was probably the first world champion. I think he was the first world champion to be killed after Formula One race. I mean, Jim Clark was killed in a Formula 2 race, but he was still at the height of his career at the time. So it was a similar scenario. The greatest racing driver in the world being killed. Finding the Austrian flag and makes you well over it sometimes when you think about it. I think for 1994, I mean, Senna must have been so disappointed, if that's probably the right word to use, because obviously with the rule changes, banning the electronics that Williams had utilised to perfection prior to that. But as Jack mentioned, he still put the car on pole position for the first two races, which again just underlines the ability he had. Senna had in fact actually been pressing for Williams to use the FW15D, which was the 93 car conformed to 94 regulation. And in Ibrahim Malik's book of 1994 F1 season, Damon Hill even reckoned that he'd have won the Brazilian Grand Prix jar in that car. So what Senna could have done with it, we'll never know. There's a really tragic story as well for the actual race in Imola, because Schumacher's Benetton, which was the new opposition, if you like, they kind of played a bit of mind games with them in warm-up because they ran deliberately slow, which indicated that they were running a one-stop strategy. So Senna got into his mind that he had to push away right from the start and get a massive lead over Schumacher. But it transpired that Schumacher actually was running a three-stop strategy and the car was very light. And of course, Senna's pressing on, pushing very hard, and he can't get away from Schumacher. But for any of us who've seen that race, there was the accident at the start. J.J. Leto stalled on the grid and he was hit by Pedro Lamy. And the safety car came out. Well, that ruined Schumacher's strategy. So all Senna had to do would have been hold him up, and the race would have been his. And it's just so ironic when you read about that.
Yeah, and I never knew that. I've had it in my head that they were kind of on equal strategies and they were just going hell for leather. The thing about the crash as well, Owen, which I think is really strange, is that we don't, to this day, we still don't know what caused it. There's all these theories floating around about what happened, but we don't know definitively what happened.
The sad thing is we never will know what happened. As you say, there's a number of sort of factors that people have cited as the causes for the car to kind of behave in the way that it did. Senna's luck really did run out because the way that the car impacted the wall, and if the steering arm had moved like 2 inches any other way, he might still be alive and with us. And that's the tragedy of it, really. Would it matter if we really knew what the cause was? I'm not even sure, to be honest.
That's the point. Yeah, the result's still the same, unfortunately, isn't it? There's so much documented about that weekend, Jack. I mean, one of the things that sticks out to me is what, say, Watkins did. Professor Sid Watkins, who was the main doctor of the FIA, or the F1 races anyway at the time, and he spoke to Senna after Ratzenberger's crash, and he was like, well, you know, I'll retire and you'll retire, and we'll both go fishing together. We both like fishing, don't we? And Senna just said, I can't quit, Sid. You know, that, I fully believe as well, because of his faith, that if he knew he was going to die that day, I don't think he would have done anything differently. He was just that kind of man.
I don't know. It's probably not my place to start discussing whether or not he would have been afraid to die behind the wheel, but I think it's that belief in his abilities that he would still be able to do what needed to be done regardless. I was maybe confidence. I'm not too sure that's the right word, but that a knowing in what he can do. It started showing up the mortality. I suppose you've got to bear in mind, it'd been a while since Formula One lost the driver. It's it would have re-highlighted the mortality of the sport, that no one was above it. One of the reactions that happened with Jim Clark was the same sort of thing. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And then sure enough, when it did happen, it's a similar sort of response. It doesn't happen to people like this.
It tragically did happen. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like you kind of feel like they're above it. They are humans just the same as the other drivers on the grid, just the same as us. Last thing we'll touch on, Alex, is of course Senna's funeral. You know, I've seen the videos, and I don't even know how many. They can't estimate how many people were there, but it was something. I think it was in the millions, wasn't it? You know, the streets were just packed in Sao Paulo. It was a full state funeral. You know, that just shows you what he meant to the people of Brazil.
Following the race, Brazil declared 3 days of mourning on his funeral, which was the Thursday after the race. As you said, I'm not entirely sure of the actual figure, but I think it was over 1 million grieving Brazilians watched it. It was a significant in terms of how just what a man of stature he was. You know, when you see a funeral like that, he wasn't just a Formula One driver. He was to Brazilians, he was a demigod. You know, the picture of his funeral, and they go to illustrate that. It was the end of an era for Formula One. Formula One had certainly lost. It took it a little bit of time to recover.
Yeah, there was a dark cloud hanging over the sport for a long time. I think it was Carl Bentlinger had an incident in Monaco. He nearly passed away. And
then after that, you had Andrea Montemini in Spain, who had a bad accident. And then in between those two races, Pedro Lamy had a massive accident in testing, which was, there's no footage of that, but reading what Johnny Herbert, who his teammate was testing on the time, if that had happened at a Grand Prix weekend, there'd have been multiple fatalities, because his car actually left the circuit because the rear wing broke, and it left the circuit and ended up under a spectator tunnel facility. So thank heavens that was on a testing session, otherwise that would have been. It just seemed there was a curse on Formula One in the early part of 1994.
Fortunately, eventually it lifted, and because of what happened that weekend at Imola, you know, we had massive safety changes, and we didn't have a fatality in Formula One while racing for 20 years. For a driver anyway. I think some marshals died in 2000 in Italy. But for no drivers to die for 20 years, and we have had some Bianchi obviously since then, and Formula 2 we've had Antoine Hubert. But you know, out of Senna's death and Ratzenberger's death, we've had people that have lived from accidents where in the past they wouldn't have done. So that is, I think we're going to wrap it up there. I think we're all getting a bit, we're all bulling up at the end of this one. Thank you for joining us, lads. Really do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're also available on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Music, Omni Studio, and Pocket Cast. Just search for the F1 Grid Talk on there. We have a Reddit if you're looking to give advice. Just go for new F1 podcast looking for advice. But a subreddit as well for Formula One Grid Talk. And we also have a Patreon as well if you want to donate to us to get new lights and recording equipment. It'd be very much appreciated. Just search Formula One Grid Talk on there. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time to review the career of another another Formula One's legends. Keep you updated with that on the F1 Chronicles Twitter as well, at F1 Chronicle on there. But yeah, until then, thank you for listening. Please make sure to share and like and follow and everything. We'll see you later. Goodbye.